Today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is David Jackson. Jacko to his friends. I can't believe it's almost the third year of Keen on Yoga podcast now. It's come so far since lockdown, and it's a way to connect and also simply keep ourselves busy and interested, right? We started off purely Ashtanga, but we've endeavored to expand out of that box, and yoga is a lifestyle, and there's people and teachers that can teach us stuff other than just Ashtanga teachers. So as always, this is a community venture, and I suggest you to give me ideas, tips and advice as to finding new and different avenues around here. So this is one of them today. David Jackson, a breathwork specialist, a professional rugby player before taking early retirement with a serious head injury resulting in a bleed on the brain and a seizure on the pitch even. After a period of recovery, he began the all clear and exercising again and felt stuck, he says, like he had the handbrake on, exercising in second gear. So he was led to inquire about all things, and that led him in the end to breath, and he found Patrick McEwen's book, The Oxygen Advantage, which is a brilliant book, by the way. You should check it out if you haven't. So he noticed immediate differences, and even in the short park runs he was doing, he had massive gains in his PBs. Anyway, he trained directly with Patrick in the method, and he's now started to teach individuals, groups, professional athletes and sports teams as well. So in the podcast, we talk about the instrumental nature of better breathing, the overall health of the body, particularly learning to breathe diaphragmatically and certainly through the nose only. Not something that many people are doing necessarily. And it also means, confusingly, that we're not getting more oxygen in what we're doing. Rather, we're better able to tolerate carbon dioxide in the body. So listen carefully for his explanation of that, because it's quite complicated, even for me. Anyway, if you haven't reviewed us already on iTunes, please do. And feel free, if you've benefited in any way, to donate live from our website at keenonyoga.com. You can directly donate to us. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this, and welcome David. So, welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast. David Jackson. I think you'd like to be known as Jacko. Is that right?
Yeah, that's how most people know me. It's a nickname that goes back from rugby and probably 4 days. But great to be here and excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So obviously, what you're known for now is specific. I mean, you do calisthenics, I know, but you specifically this style of breathing, or encouraging breath work as a way into movement, right? Or the basis of movement. So do you want to tell me how you got into it in the first place?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm passionate about with breath work, or the breathing side of things, however you want to sort of package it up or describe it, is that trying to make breath work a normal thing, trying to make it normal part of our day-to-day lives, or part of our training, and just part of our mindset or our psyche. Because for me, it was I effectively sort of stumbled across this after I used to play professional rugby. I retired from a head injury back in 2013, had a seizure on the training field and a bleed on the brain. And at the time, back then, wasn't aware of the effect that would have on the respiratory center part of your brain, and that then affecting our breathing patterns. And I started to, it took me a year to be able to run and exercise without getting headaches. But once I got back to sort of feeling like full, back to, giving the all clear and sort of like, you're all fine. I felt that, best way to describe it is I felt like I had the handbrake slightly on. When you're like in your car and you pull off, and it's like, it's just not quite, like, everything's okay, but it's just not quite going somewhere. So feeling a bit restricted. And I delved into a few different bits and pieces, and I sort of put it down to probably a little bit of intuition. I'd retrained as a strength and conditioning coach, was starting to understand the body a little bit better. And when breathing sort of popped up as a as this thing that's happening all the time. It's a movement pattern involving muscles and joints, and starting to view that as a thing of like, okay, well, if we're doing that potentially 25,000 times a day, if thinking of one breath being a repetition, if I was doing like 20,000 bad bodyweight squats every day, like I'd probably have bad hips or knees. Yeah. And so I sort of, it was like, mate, and then as soon as I asked myself the question, like, well, are you breathing right? I was like, how do you even answer that? I don't know. How do you answer that question?
Yeah.
I got recommended to read the book, The Oxygen Advantage, and sort of.
Okay, so that's
never
Patrick McEwen. Right?
Patrick McEwen. Yeah. So,
okay. Yeah. It's a great book, worth reading. Yeah.
Yeah. No, fantastic book. It was. Yeah. I'm not even very good at reading, and I didn't put that thing down. I just like rattled through it. And sort of to try sort of fast forward now. That was a few years ago. Fast forward now, I did my instructor training with Patrick McEwen, and that was as a course of I wasn't looking to become an Oxygen Advantage instructor because I wanted to necessarily teach other people. At the time, still working as a strength and conditioning coach. It was purely to finish the sort of rehabilitation and take that handbrake off my own from my own previous sort of poor breathing.
I suppose head injury. Yeah. I suppose the obvious question here is how did it feel like when you took the handbrake off? I mean, did you experience the benefits immediately before we get into what the Oxygen Advantage is?
Yeah,
I just kind of encourage people to to listen on. What was the result of it?
Yes, I saw this big flashing light, and life was changed.
Yeah, that's what we want to hear. Exactly.
No, but I don't think that's a mirage that we think we want to hear. In the when the reward of doing something comes in the challenge of doing it. If something happens really quickly, the reward is very small. Whereas when you've worked hard for something, the reward is much bigger. Now, the breathing side of things, that's not to say, so some things you will notice a difference immediately. Other things take time to change habits depending on how bad or how dysfunctional your breathing has come in terms of either the mechanics of how you're breathing or the what we describe as like the biochemistry, like how your body deals with oxygen and carbon dioxide. Some of those things take a bit of time to change. I noticed one of the things so what sort of got me hooked was I used to be a professional rugby player. I'd got back into my running. Back then I was doing like 5K runs. My PB at the time was like 20 minutes 15. It was a reasonable pace for running. So I thought that I was pretty fit, and I was like, I used to be a professional player. So and my thing was like, I'm not a big guy. My thing was like being fast and being fit. I did one of the tests with the Oxygen Advantage, where it's like a carbon dioxide, a test of CO2 tolerance. So holding the breath after a normal exhale to your first desire to breathe. So not like there's no willpower involved in it. Just when does your body trigger you to want to breathe? And mine was like less than 10 seconds, which put me in a category of, you've probably got some sort of severe asthma breathing problem. And I was like, I don't, and I never have. And I was like, it really shocked me. And I don't like being not good at something. And I was thinking, my mindset at the time, I'm thinking, okay, has my respiratory, do I need to do some work on my breathing to help with recovering my head injury? There's some research that shows that like if you've had a concussive event, I think it was suggesting like 99, like over 99%, like as close to as you've probably got an effect on your breathing patterns or your breathing habits or your respiratory center being disrupted as a result of that concussion. It's just it's like part and parcel of it. So that affects like oxygen, like blood supply to the brain and oxygen to the brain. That if it's not just stays in a bit of a vicious cycle if you don't do anything about it. So I was doing this test to find out, well, where am I at? And then thinking, oh, maybe it is something I need to work on. And then it was like, crikey, I didn't expect it to be that bad. And it was like, right, I need to do something about this. One of the things that one of the big things, we can go into a little bit more detail, but asking about some of the things we noticed. One of the big things is about getting used to using your nose for breathing rather than the mouth. And a lot of your listeners will have come across this. And they might just, be good breathers and do it quite naturally. And it was something for me during exercise, and say during running, it was like I tried to breathe through just using my nose, and I couldn't get to the end of my road, which was like 50 meters away. It was just like snot everywhere. It was just awful. And I was like, again, like, what? So if my nose is designed for breathing, like if I can't use it, like how has it become so maladaptive? Like, what do I need to do to sort this out? And I got a nice win when I spent about 6 weeks. I didn't change anything about my training. I wasn't like mad into running. I used to do like a 5K park run once a week. That was basically my training, was just doing the park run. And I'd just run around as fast as I can, see how I get on. There was no tactics or anything. And all I changed was in my training, I was trying to breathe through my nose, finding it fairly difficult at the start, or really difficult at the start. I'm gradually getting a bit better at it. During the actual, then 6 weeks of that, I did a new park run, one in Sheffield I'd never done before, so I didn't even know the course. I ran around that, and I didn't do it all nasal breathing because I was running at a too fast a pace that I'd not adapted to be able to do it at that sort of pace. But I was aware of some of the things around, try and stay away from panting, losing your breath, and try and keep the breath larger and slower at least, and that sort of thing. So I was trying to do some of those things. Crossed the finish line. Didn't think I'd done very well. Didn't feel amazing at that point. I didn't even look at my watch for a few minutes because I just was a bit like that was pretty average. Finally, a few minutes later, I looked at my watch and I'd ran a new PB, 19 minutes, like 16, I think it is.
Right.
And I was like, what? I was like, wow, I could have broke 19 minutes because basically towards the end, I didn't know that the end was coming because I'd never run the course before. I was like, I could have done a bit more of a sprint and finish type of thing. And I was like, that just blew my mind. I was like, for the last 6 weeks, I've not even put into place these things. And this has had a huge impact on my performance. That sort of then really started to hook me in. The other things around sort of how the sort of, I guess, the mindful element you get from spending time focusing on your breathing, the calming effect on the nervous system, the effect on recovery, these types of things, how effect that has on then sleep. Those more holistic things came probably secondary to me. That is like turns this into a package that I'm like, wow, this is for everyone, and this is something that everyone can benefit from, whether you want to do it because of sport or whether you want to do it not because of sport. You're going to get all the benefits of it because it's all wrapped up in improving the way we breathe, and we're breathing every minute of every day. Doesn't matter whether you're doing yoga, rugby, running, washing the dishes, sleeping, you're always breathing. And so if we're able to understand a little bit around how to do it a little bit better, a little bit more efficiently, a little bit nicer for the body to cope with that, like the body responds beautifully to it. And that's why I'm sort of passionate about having felt those changes over now, like a good few years.
Yeah, how long have you done it?
That was probably about 3-4 years ago when I first started to try and delve, like probably 4 years ago when I first started to delve into it. Probably just messed about for the first year. And then for the last few years got a lot more serious with it. And one of the things I want to try and help people, because breath, people like Wim Hof and Patrick McKeown, breath work as a term is something that like is a bit sexy at the moment, and people are like into it and engaged in it. And something that I come across a lot with some of the clients that I work with, and just notice just in general, is that because it's now got like a term, it gets like put in a box sort of over here. I'm going, someone might be like, I'm going to yoga for this hour, and then I'll do it. And then after lunch, I'll do some breath work. Or do you know what I mean? Thinking about it as this extra thing I've got to do on top of all the other things I'm doing. I'm all too busy. And that's not how it works, or not how it needs to work. If you're doing a specific, breathwork practice, like Wim Hof breathing, what many people I'm sure will have heard of.
Or pranayama and yoga.
Then you're going to dedicate separate time. But equally, your brain and your nervous system is paying attention to how you are breathing to manage and balance its pH and the nervous system, blood pressure, and all these other elements within the body. Is monitoring that all the time. So it's not about the 30 minutes that you might set aside each day to do it, because there's another, if my math is all right, 23 and a half hours through the rest of the day that actually the brain's going to respond to how you're breathing during then, more so than the 30 minutes practice you do, potentially, if that makes sense.
So this is something you can do all day.
Well,
you're paying attention to
everyone that can hear this podcast right now, they're breathing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That is one of the things, and trying to understand that. Yeah. And help.
So, what is the oxygen advantage then? We need to cut to the chase here, what's the technique?
You mentioned the author of the book, The Oxygen Advantage. I think obviously it started as a book. Patrick McKeown, he'd been within the breathing research for over 20 years now, and he developed this framework for breathing, aimed initially, I guess, at a bit more of the sports performance side of things. And it's just carried on broadening out from there. And so the Oxygen Advantage is a framework of breathing techniques and exercises that are all based on science and proven by and taken from the research within the scientific community around what the benefits and how the way we breathe is going to improve things like our well-being as well as our performance. And a lot of that is based upon understanding, going back to like, how are we designed to breathe, and trying to be able to use those best breathing practices in terms of functional breathing mechanics, understanding to how we improve the biochemistry of the body. That's just a fancy word for saying, like, how does your body utilize oxygen and deal with the carbon dioxide that the body creates? And then, how do you use that in your day-to-day life or within the training that you do? So how do you use it within yoga if you spend a lot of time doing it?
I suppose the first principle, which you talk about a lot on the stuff you put out, is to breathe through your nose, right? Which is not always as easy when you're under stress as one might imagine, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure the yoga people listening probably assume they're breathing through their nose all the time, but if you're doing and exerting yourself in movement, then it doesn't always happen. I mean, what's the first way to start to train yourself to get into the habit of just doing that even under duress? You mentioned your run, and how you couldn't run to the end of the street without starting to breathe through your mouth, right? Like how do you train that when you're really really up against it?
Well, you make some. It's
and I suppose let's rewind. Why to breathe? I mean, if people aren't breathing through their nose, you also talk quite eloquently on why to breathe through your nose in the first place, which might be where we might start.
It's a great question. It's like, it might sound like a simple question.
It seems obvious,
spent about half an hour talking about this. It's a bit because you said a couple of things. You said, like, you use the word stress, and when we mouth breathing is actually associated with our stress response. So associated with that sympathetic tone. If people are happy with those sort of technical terms for the nervous system, sympathetic being like fight or flight, stress response, parasympathetic relaxation, rest, digest, and a simple phrase that can land easily, or people to remember, like, the nose is designed for breathing and the mouth is designed for eating. And that's not just like a nice phrase to say. There's some research that's been done. I think it was like maybe the 70s. I think the guy was called Cottle, had found or identified 30 different design functions of the nose that proves it's designed for breathing, which the mouth has none of. And I think in that research, he said, like, I expect in the coming years for us to find like a whole lot more as well. Like, this is just what we've covered. So, some of those things are like your when you nasal breathe, or your nose is linked more towards your diaphragm, whereas your mouth is more linked towards sort of upper chest breathing. But again, really linked to that sort of like shallower.
Why do you think that is?
Response. Because your diaphragm is designed for breathing. Your diaphragm is your number one.
But why do you think the nose is linked to the diaphragm?
Because that's effectively, as in a design perspective, one of the things is that the nose provides about 50% more resistance to your breathing.
Yes, that's exactly what I feel. The aperture.
Pull against.
Yes, exactly. The aperture is narrower. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
So that's not to say, this was the thing that I had, was the case of like the way I'd been breathing had become dysfunctional. So the mechanics of how I was getting the air in, I wasn't really utilizing my diaphragm. I wasn't getting good rib articulation. And switching to nasal breathing, so trying to breathe through the nose, didn't suddenly make me a great diaphragmatic breather. I had to work on those things separately.
Yeah, of course.
I had a bad habit of lifting the rib cage.
Yes, and we'll go on to the diaphragm, I think, later. What about, I mean, you mentioned something that I found curious, I think, in something I was looking at that you were doing about, was it the nose and then nitrous oxide or
Nitric
something
oxide.
like that? Yeah.
So nitric oxide is a gas found in the nasal cavity, not in the mouth, and it's a vasodilator. It's also antiviral, so it's like protects us against viruses. Breathing through your nose, like the mouth. The virus provides no protection. It actually can be damaging or harmful for your airways. And if you think that there's very little resistance when you're breathing in through the mouth, so it's actually your diaphragm can just go on holiday and not get involved in breathing, but then that just leaves you to then have to lift the upper chest, and that becomes a shallow breath. There's less blood in the higher regions of the lungs because gravity pulls blood down towards the bottom of the lungs. And one of the things that nitric oxide does is, as a vasodilator, it helps open up those airways so your nose can feel clearer when you start to use it more because you're utilizing that as a vasodilator. And it also helps to distribute blood within the lungs more evenly so you can have more efficient transfer. It's easier for the oxygen in the lungs to get then into the blood itself. And that, getting air, the process of breathing, it's not just like how you get air in. Once it's in your lungs, how efficiently is it getting into your blood? And then it doesn't finish there. It's how efficiently does it get from your blood into your actual tissues. And every cell in our body needs oxygen to create energy. So how we do that is very important.
Any tips for breathing through your nose when you've got a mask over your nose?
Well, I get so the mask. Interestingly, the mask is.
It's hard, because I generally kind of start to breathe by my mouth. I've got a panic when I've got the whole mask on,
So do you know what that feeling of panic or wanting to go like, oh, I'm going to breathe through my mouth, feeling like I need to breathe through my mouth now, that feeling of suffocation, or we describe as like air hunger, is just the fact that like carbon dioxide in your body is starting to rise because you're trying to breathe through your nose, which provides 50% more resistance, but now you've got a mask on as well. That's going to provide it even more resistance. So the resistance slows down the breathing, and it's not then necessarily that feeling of air hunger and the desire to breathe a little bit, make it easier to breathe and therefore breathe through the mouth. It's coming from oxygen being low. It's coming from carbon dioxide levels rising. The respiratory center in the brainstem is most responsive to carbon dioxide or another way to put it, the carbon dioxide levels rising is our primary stimulus to breathe. And if you think that when you've got a mask on, some of that carbon dioxide that you do exhale can be pooling and staying in the mask, and then you're going to rebreathe it in. So the feeling is, that's where that feeling is coming from. Now, I did see someone say something quite when the whole mask thing was coming out, and people making some relatively false claims about it. Someone pointed out that surgeons have been wearing masks for hours at a time doing operations. It's like it's not something. It's not like at all a dangerous thing to wear a mask, and it's certainly not a thing that can't be done. And actually, if you find it, that sort of feeling of breathing through a mask quite difficult when you try to breathe through your nose and you get that feeling of like air hunger or almost like suffocation or panic, it's a sign that your tolerance to carbon dioxide has been disrupted. You're too sensitive to it. And that's something that you do really want to address by, the techniques we use around like slowing our breathing down. There's even some breath holding work that we do to help improve that and just get the body and those receptors in the brainstem that monitor levels of carbon dioxide, just get them more comfortable with an adequate level of carbon dioxide. Because carbon dioxide, again, is like the nitric oxide, such a vital thing within the body. It's not a waste gas that we just have to get rid of. Yeah. You do have to breathe excess amounts out, but it's the main catalyst that allows oxygen to be released from hemoglobin in the blood to get into your tissues. Right. So without adequate levels of carbon dioxide, hemoglobin stays more strongly attached, or its affinity to oxygen stays stronger. So more oxygen is going to stay in your blood, and you're going to feel out of breath still more when you could be doing your yoga training or whatever. It's also maybe speak a bit more on the carbon dioxide, because I think the assumption is that you want as much oxygen in your blood as possible, as low as possible as carbon dioxide. But from what I can see from what you're saying, maybe it's that you just want more tolerance to the carbon dioxide in the blood. Yeah, that's
Is that
one
right?
of that's one of the literally like the main things. If you what I was going to say about like one of the other things about the carbon dioxide is it's that as well as a vasodilator, it helps like your blood vessels dilate. It helps with circulation, so it helps actually stuff go around. Whereas when you breathe too fast and breathe too much carbon dioxide out because you've become too sensitive to it, your blood vessels will constrict, and people will say things like, "Yeah, no, I've got really cold hands and feet." There's a sign of struggling with circulation. That can be one of the things that could be a sign of that. And that, as you rightly say about that feeling, because carbon dioxide is that primary stimulus to breathe. That feeling I need to breathe isn't because your oxygen's got so low that you've got to take a breath in. They sort of report in the literature that your blood oxygen saturation, so the amount of oxygen that's saturated with the amount of your blood that's saturated with oxygen, needs to drop to like below 60 before you're going to be like, and at that point you're more likely to pass out than anything, that you're going to actually get triggered to breathe. The stimulus to breathe comes from the CO2 levels rising. And even when they will measure people's SpO2, so measure their blood oxygen saturation and measure their carbon dioxide levels. The pulse oximeters that you can get off Amazon for like 20 quid can give you a reasonable, and some of the more advanced Apple watches and things like that will give you some level of your blood oxygen saturation.
Yeah.
If you take that and measure it when you are, so normal ranges are like 95 to 99. You don't want.
Sorry, I mean, just to clarify, the aim is to have a higher blood oxygen saturation. Is that right? As well.
So it's a great question. So normal ranges is 95 to 99. You don't want 100%, because if it was 100%, that would mean it's all filled up and none of it's leaving. And if none of it's leaving, it's staying in your blood and not getting to tissues, and you're going to die.
Right. Okay.
You want it to be 100. 99 to 95 is normal. When you're exercising, even at really high intensities, like, the hardest yoga session that you've ever done, put your pulse oximeter on, it won't be anywhere near below 90. When people are doing like high anaerobic, like lactate tolerance type of sprint work, repeat sprint work, like it might smidge below 95. You might get 93, 94. The issue that we have is that like CO2 levels have risen to such a high level, and things like your lactic acid is building up, and your body's ability to buffer that lactate. The carbon dioxide is linked in with that because it's all to do with the H+ ions that are created. Our ability to deal with those things rising is what dictates whether we're going to have to slow our intensity of the exercise down, or how we're going to be able to recover.
That carbon dioxide in the blood that's not leaving, right? And that's causing the problem.
So it will be. So it's going to go. The carbon dioxide is produced in the cells. It's going to go into your blood. It's going to go to the lungs. Then you're going to breathe it out.
Right. And we should be getting rid of that, or should we be able to tolerate it in the body as well?
So we obviously have to get rid of it, but it's changing our tolerance to it. So where I am at now compared to when I started, I said the first time I did one of the tests, it was like took like 9 seconds before my body wanted to breathe, and that was like bad. We want it to be like 25 seconds or above. I'm able to now tolerate much higher levels of carbon dioxide in the body than previously. What does that actually look like in practice? It means that my breathing is able to be at rest, like super gentle. When I'm exercising, my breathing is still at low level intensity. My breathing is still very calm, so in practical low
terms, less panting, basically. Tolerance of carbon dioxide, less panting, less being out of breath, which obviously is a very positive thing for training.
Yeah. So you're carrying on having a really nice efficient supply of oxygen to your tissues. The other thing is when your respiratory rate will be.
Does the carbon dioxide get in the way of the oxygen supply to the tissue then?
Say that again.
Does the carbon dioxide get in the way of the oxygen? Because obviously you've got oxygen saturation in the blood, but that's the $1 million question is, does that oxygen saturation in the blood translate to efficient take-up in the tissue, right?
Yeah. So
what causes the better take-up or lack thereof?
Yeah. So the carbon dioxide is, I mentioned this before, carbon dioxide being the catalyst to allow oxygen to be released from hemoglobin. if you are breathing too much of it out and you don't have a lot of it, oxygen is going to stay more so in the blood rather than getting into the tissues. So we want the carbon dioxide, the higher levels of carbon dioxide allow your body to get the oxygen from your blood into your tissues where it's needed, to help you then not actually feel quite so out of breath.
It's quite confusing for someone who isn't a scientist. I know you're a science teacher, so.
So if you just think that
it's all easy for you, mate. But no, it is a bit confusing. But let's go practically now. Like how did you start, and like what's the basic method for starting this? Right, like holding your breath. I mean, how do you start apart from the nasal breathing, which I know that is tantamount to just. So how do you instruct beginners for this?
Great question. And just to say, like in terms of those practical things, the other little bit I was just going to say of like when if our respiratory rate has come down, because I'm able to breathe a little bit calmer and a little bit slower because I can deal with more carbon dioxide. I'm wasting less energy on actually the process of breathing, so I'm not doing it as much. Okay. And then you start to also see, how does my heart rate relate into this? So if you're breathing less, your heart rate will be less. So then I'm starting to become more, if my body is literally becoming more efficient at the things that I'm doing. And if that's yoga, you're going to be more efficient in the actual practice that you're doing. Your breathing will be under control more. You'll be able to manage either a higher intensity of what you're doing in your session, or you're going to feel an awful lot more relaxed in that session. The nervous system is going to be a bit calmer. What's that going to do for the range of motion that your body's going to be able to go into? It's going to give you potential to access greater range of motion or deeper positions in some of your postures. And that's another thing that the carbon dioxide does. Elevated levels of carbon dioxide, it helps the muscles to relax and can help us to get into when we're going into stretches. So that's why doing some of the breath holding techniques I'm not a yoga instructor. I've done some yoga in the past and found it so difficult. I was like, I definitely wasn't thinking about my breathing.
I don't know. You look in good shape.
Hell I was doing. It was like, I'd probably do a little bit better now if I went to
I think you would
previously. But but there are, some good friends of mine are also, Oxygen Advantage coaches and yoga teachers, and they will utilize some of the breath holding as part of
carbon dioxide relaxes the muscles. That's interesting. I mean, as a kind of aside here, I'm kind of thinking, do you think this is silly, someone like Usain Bolt or like someone at the top of their game, like Ronaldo or something. Do you think they're naturally using this breathing technique, or can you be a great athlete without doing this at all? We just through panting breathing,
you're gonna hit a limit and hit a ceiling of like what you can do if we think that make it as simple as possible. You said it can be confusing. Let's make it as simple as possible. Every cell, there's a good point there, but every cell in our body needs oxygen. Everyone would agree with that. It needs oxygen to create energy. Every cell in the body creates carbon dioxide as well as part of that process. So how you get oxygen in and how you deal with that carbon dioxide that gets created, that's got to be important and is going to affect the threshold of what you can work at. So if you're maximizing your diet, your sleep, you're maximizing your training, all these different aspects, but you're leaving how you breathe to one side, then by maximizing the way you're getting that oxygen in and dealing with the carbon dioxide that gets created, we'll definitely see improvements in your sporting performances for sure.
Do you look at sporting people now and check and see? I say that breathing terribly. If they just sorted out their breathing and stopped panting.
It's one of those things. Like when you're blissfully unaware.
Oh, look at that! God.
When you're blissfully, it's not just when I just walk. When you see anyone.
Oh right, you sit down the street.
Not look at how someone's breathing.
You could stand outside McDonald's.
But it's when you start working with clients and teaching people, during those sessions, you're purposely your job is to help them with their breathing. So you've got to look and analyze their breathing and do it in a way that they don't feel like you're looking at how they're breathing. You want to try and make it feel normal, but then that teaches your eye to pick up cues around how people are breathing. And then, you can't switch that off. You're walking down the street and someone runs past me, panting like a dog. And you're like, oh man, I need to talk to you. But
just take him aside. See how they react.
I've tried just shouting at people, shut your mouth.
No, you haven't.
Like that, apparently. I don't know what.
Have you really?
No.
Fantastic. No, that'd be good. Yeah. Okay. So how do you begin? Like, what's
the practical tips? Yeah. So one of the things that we said to start with, that we said you've already mentioned around like, can I breathe in the nose? And one of the things that when I'm working with like in the sort of like sports performance field is I will address the fact that before we start doing any of the sexy stuff, before we start talking about how do you recover your breathing when you're really struggling now because you're maxing out, all these things, it's like we need to address your base level, your foundation, your day-to-day breathing habits. If you breathe poorly at rest, when you start doing yoga, it's only going to get worse. So for one nice one, really simple one for people to test for themselves would be to just set 1 minute on your stopwatch and then just sit down, nice and relaxed, and just count and observe. Don't change your breathing, but just count how many breaths in and out is one. How many breaths do you do within that minute?
It also seems a lot to do with just changing habits and remembering, right? Or setting a different precedent, because how much of the time in the day do you actually focus on your breathing, even if you do a lot of yoga or a lot of training outside, like when you sit down to watch the TV, you can still breathe terribly outside your particular focus time. Yeah,
exactly. And so what you're trying to do is there'll be this phase where you're like relearning a new habit and you'll have to consciously think about it. But then gradually, as that starts to get embedded in, what you want to get to the point of like, you breathe nice and calmly in and out through the nose. It's relatively slow and it's calm. At rest, there doesn't need to be an awful lot of like movement. It should be relatively quiet, if not silent, if you literally sat down at rest. And that starts to become just then the new norm for you. You got to think that my belief is that the body wants to breathe well. It has, this nose that's designed for breathing. The diaphragm is our number one respiratory. It wants to breathe really nicely and it wants to breathe really well. We just have to create the environment, the conditions for it to do so. And when you start to set that up, it will happily do what it's designed to do. And so it's the initial phase is, you got to consciously think about it. And
do you still kind of consciously check in during the day? How am I breathing, or is it just become like a natural thing?
Well, you're trying to get to the point where it starts to become just normal and natural for that to happen. But anytime, because we're talking about breathing now, I'm thinking about mine a little bit. You just can't not. People that are listening to the podcast now, you will now. Like I guarantee you, over the next few seconds, because we're talking about thinking about your breathing. You can't not think about it. Like it just happens. Interestingly, one of the things about talking, when you're talking, are you inhaling or are you exhaling?
Yes.
What are you doing when you're talking? Inhaling or exhaling? This is a little test for you.
Okay, I think I am.
Try and talk on an inhale. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you do, that would be strange.
You can't talk on inhale. So when you're talking,
actually, I'll tell you what. We're in France right now, so that's why I know the exhale is the talking, because it's so nasal.
Right, yeah.
The sounds, right? The accent. Yeah. You can tell. A lot of it is actually it's a different use of the nose in the language, literally. Right? It's interesting.
Yeah. Bonjour. But you're exhaling. So
it's an exhale.
When you're talking a lot, that means you're exhaling a lot, and then you're potentially setting yourself up. Particularly if you get a bit excited about talking about something like I do, then you start talking faster. That means then you're just breathing faster, and then
should we talk less?
Well, but effectively through talking fast, you're breathing fast, and then that's getting you in a cycle of over breathing, which again is then getting rid of too much of that carbon dioxide. So it's a little bit of an awareness of that can just help us for those that, there'll be plenty of people listening that have to talk a lot for their jobs. And it's a case of like, not saying don't talk, but try and be aware. How fast are you breathing? Can we put a few little pauses in? Can we slow things down?
Yeah. And you mentioned that actually before that the body is designed to breathe properly through the nose. I mean, what would stop us or change our breathing and start us breathing through the mouth? I think you've answered this already, that a lot of it is, one, it's just simply bad habits sometimes, maybe levels of fitness, but also for people that are interested, especially in this podcast, is emotional resonance, right?
Yeah. If we're stressed, we're more likely
the fight or flight response tends to make one immediately kind of start breathing through the mouth, right? Default to the mouth. I mean, did you notice when you changed your breathing habits that you had a change in kind of emotional sense of self as well? Did it change you on a deeper level?
Yeah, far more mindful, far more present, far more able to so do I still get relaxed and anxious about things? Yes. When various different things happen. But of course, do I feel like I have a tool in my breathing which allows me to, when you feel stressed or anxious, like physically you feel changes within your body, and your breathing changes as one of those things, and it starts to become faster. Your heartbeat starts to,
and you notice this now.
Yeah, and if my heartbeat is increasing and my breathing is increasing, and I'm starting to get a little bit more agitated, and my nervous system is obviously there getting like a little bit ramped up, what's the one thing I can take control of and slow down? It's my breathing, so I can focus on slowing down my breathing. I might even do some little pauses in there. That's one really nice one, like just literally for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, little pauses every 2 breaths. So if you're literally, this is one of the things we teach if someone is really struggling with like panic attacks, because when we get into that over breathing cycle, it's just getting rid of all that carbon dioxide, and we have to just put a bit of a break. Like I think of it as like a bit of a circuit breaker in there, just like quote Boris himself, but a bit of a circuit breaker. Boom, here's a stop, then 2 normal breaths, then a couple of seconds holding the breath, then 2 normal breaths, then maybe 3 seconds holding the breath, 2 normal breaths. It gives us something to focus on and think about. But what it does is it slows down our respiratory rate. When we slow down our breathing, we start to influence the nervous system. When we influence the nervous system, the heart rate starts to come down. You can start to actually bring yourself back to a little bit more of a calming state, rather than being
like a baseline of
knowing that you've got a tool to help you, rather than feeling like.
So do you use the breathing outside training now? Do you? I mean,
100%.
Do you?
All the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And what kind of breath training do you do? I suppose we should still back up and ask, outside the nasal breathing, how do you
we still get through those practical.
Yeah, we haven't really got into the nuts and bolts of, are you slowing, are you holding, are you doing breath retention work?
The very simplest, you've got like two elements to it. If you take, aside from like breathing in and out through the nose, like that's just the sort of the given. Aside from that, we've got slowing down the breathing and lightening the breath, quietening the breath. So like in a calming and relaxing manner. Then the other side of it is we've got breath holding. So retention's holding the breath. We like to do
when you're training, or so when you're kind of training to try and slow down the breath, or just generally?
Both.
Right.
So you can having times of practicing slowing down your breath when you're, say, before you go into bed, is going to help your body down-regulate and calm down and relax, so you're in a state of parasympathetic recovery mode to help you have a better, more restorative night's sleep. But also it's going to be easy, whilst you're lying in bed, it's going to be easier for you to slow down your breathing, because the metabolic demand of lying there is much less than when you're running or doing yoga. So practicing breathing on its own, so that you can then use that when you are doing your given exercise of, say, yoga, and you go and do an exercise that you know comfortably, and start to integrate in some slower breathing, quieter, calmer breathing patterns into that, then you're starting to merge those two things together. The breath holding is something that allows you to practice getting mentally used to that feeling of air hunger, and remembering now, okay, when I feel that desire to breathe in, or breathe faster, or breathe more, it's not because oxygen's low, it's because CO2 levels are rising. And I know
sort of retraining the brain to respond to that kind of feeling of panic, right?
Exactly. So there's an emotional side of it. Plus there's actually like the biochemistry side of it. You are spending some time holding the breath where you're keeping the carbon dioxide in the body, so the body gets better at dealing with that, and you then change your sensitivity to that carbon dioxide buildup, which is then better for your efficiency of breathing overall. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. You've got slowing the breathing down. We've got doing some breath holds. The breath holding work is just some protocols on that of if you're pregnant, or have any serious underlying health conditions, we shouldn't be doing strong breath holds, but it's completely safe and normal to do for everyone that's fit, well, and healthy. We do them with the Oxygen Advantage specifically after a normal exhale, because we're trying to get the body used to oxygen being low and CO2 being high, this hypoxic, hypercapnic effect.
And what kind of start, what kind of times are we looking at to start just getting used to this?
So we would start, if you're doing them, like initially you might start doing them stationary, but we want to get people to actually used to like moving about and doing it. So we would start with something like after stationary, the easiest thing is then just walking before you try and do it running or in any yoga pose or anything like that. So holding the breath. So normal breath in, normal breath out, pinch the nose, start walking and count how many paces you take. And to start with,
you're not doing sedentary. I mean, it's kind of funny for yoga people who do the kind of breathing stuff we call pranayamas, completely sedentary, right? And you're actually moving around doing the holds.
Well, if you think that if to do it sedentary, the metabolic demand, so the amount of oxygen your body requires, the amount of CO2 that's building up is less. Your breath hold time is going to be reduced when you're moving about or doing exercise, but the intensity of the breath hold in terms of improving your ability to deal with those changes in blood gases is going to happen quicker. So it's can be a little bit more efficient, but also if you are, the more specific you can do when you get comfortable at doing it. So you need to get used to this like really weird feeling of like holding the breath. The brain's going to notice CO2 levels have risen. It's going to send a message to the diaphragm. The diaphragm's going to contract and you're going to feel like you're suffocating. It's not going to feel nice to start with. Most people don't find it a comfortable thing to do initially. You need to mentally learn to relax into that. And when you can start to get more confident and comfortable, it might, for a lot of people, getting to 20 paces to start with walking, people could try this. Getting to 20 can be difficult to start with. I thought I was going to die. It reminded me of actually sort of swallowing water as a kid in a swimming pool and feeling like you're going to drown. It literally brought back those types of feelings. It was like, wow, this is interesting. But we try to get people above 60 steps. And for like professional athletes, we're looking at getting them like around 100. And it's like, that just seems absolutely crazy when you can't do like 20 steps at the start. I remember thinking,
how many minutes would that be, do you think?
So 60 paces tends to be around about 30 seconds, depending on how fast you walk. That's
doable. And then and have you built that yourself? Like how? From where did you start and where are you at now? Just out of curiosity.
I started at like couldn't get to 20 paces.
20 breaths right? Okay,
20 paces, which would
20
be
paces. Sorry, you're not really at all.
It's probably not even 10 seconds.
Okay, yeah.
And then I do a variety of different, like integrate it into lots of different things. Now, if I was doing just straight walking, I could do 100 or so and do them like walking or fast walking, turn it into a jog, or even just like sprinting. I think
so. You're holding your breath and sprinting now.
Yeah, or doing squats or
glutton for punishment, aren't you?
Whatever. No, it's if you go
masochist.
The thing is, if you think of it like this, the purpose of doing it is to improve my body's tolerance to carbon dioxide and get used to oxygen levels coming down. When one of the responses the body has for oxygen levels reducing, so I said like your blood oxygen saturation when you're doing a really hard exercise will barely drop below 95%. It'll barely drop below normal. When we hold the breath and do it, our blood oxygen will drop down into the 80s comfortably, which is similar to being about 4,000 or 5,000 meters of altitude. So it's used as a technique to simulate altitude training. And there's some responses that the body does in the short term.
Actually, can I just ask you
to improve? I
think Patrick talks in his book a lot about altitude training, right? He's done it with kind of like Ethiopian marathon runners, right? I think that was, as I remember. What is the benefit again of being at altitude for the oxygen and for the health? Right? Why does it produce such some strength and health?
So it's to do with the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So as I was like saying there, but if you're at altitude where there's less oxygen, or you hold your breath and the body experiences less oxygen, one of the things that the body does in response or an adaptation to that is in the immediate term, it will, the spleen, which acts as like a blood bank, holds about 8% additional red blood cells for us. The spleen contracts, and I like to think of it as it basically contracts to like give you some more red blood cells because it's noticed, right, crikey, oxygen's dropped down to say 85%. blood oxygen saturation. Here's some more red blood cells, Jacko, to like help deal with this problem that's happened. It doesn't know that you're holding your breath. It just knows that oxygen's low. So that happens immediately and can last for up to about an hour, depending on the research you look at, and is the strongest contraction of the spleen happens after 5 strong breath holds lasting 30 seconds or more. That seems to be the tipping point. And in the long-term effects are, because then after an hour or so, the spleen will reabsorb those red blood cells and bring you back to normal. But there is a longer-term effect that happens where your kidneys are stimulated to produce naturally more EPO, which then there's about a delay of about 3 to 4 days, where then in response to that increase in natural EPO levels, your bone marrow produce more red blood cells. So you then see an increase over time of your red blood cell count, just a few percent, but it makes a big difference for how. If you've got more red blood cells, that's more oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. That's more efficiency of getting oxygen into the tissues. Like, you feel better. It's one of those things that for me, knowing that now, it's like, it's a no-brainer. It's something I wish I knew when I played rugby, but we live and we learn.
Before you go, and we need to talk about the diaphragm a little bit. You mentioned, first of all, just because you're breathing through the nose doesn't mean you're using a diaphragm at all. And for a lot of people, it's a bit of a, one draws a blank a little bit. Am I breathing with the diaphragm or am I not using the diaphragm? How do you know?
Yes.
And how did you train yourself to start contacting the diaphragm with your breath? Because this is the fundamental issue of breathing.
When I said to you, I was like, ask myself the question, am I breathing right? I was like,
yeah, exactly.
Like, how do I answer that? And then it was like,
how do you answer it? Yeah, breathing. Like,
okay, use your diaphragm. And I was like,
fair enough. How do you do that? What's that? What does that feel like?
You put your hands, if you sort of like put your hands on your stomach and then you sort of like tense your abs and you're like, no, I'm just tensing my abs, I think. Like, what?
Yeah. And that's obviously going to freeze the diaphragm.
It's going to keep your ribs in, which then stops you. If ribs need to move out to create space for the diaphragm to move down, so like the rib cage articulation, your diaphragm movement.
So often people say, well, I should breathe in your stomach and then you'd use the diaphragm. What do you say to that?
There's some people that really don't like the term like belly breathing or stomach, because your stomach.
Yeah, I don't like it. That's why I said it to you.
Your lungs, your lungs, the tissue
aren't in the
lungs
stomach,
are in the ribs, like the housed by the rib cage. It's not in the stomach.
Yes.
But it's the concept. The goodwill of it is basically trying to go like, let's not upper chest breathe. Let's breathe from lower down there, and people might say belly or stomach.
Yeah, and also if you keep some kind of form of relaxation in that area rather than clenching your abs,
because the abs will keep, and your obliques and your abdominal will keep the ribs down and in, and that's stopping them from actually expanding laterally and allowing space to the diaphragm. So one thing, we could do this right now. People can listen along to this one. You're going to feel the diaphragm contract. Is we do what we call a blocked inhalation. So we would do a normal breath in through the nose, a normal breath out through the nose, pinch the nose. And then whilst you basically create a vacuum because, you're not allowing air to come in or out, if you try to breathe in and focus on that area around, I like to put my hands where my 2 lower ribs are. Put your hands there. So that's where you focus on breathing too. Try and breathe in whilst you're holding your breath after an exhale, and you'll feel that diaphragm like pulling down. If you try and breathe in really strongly, you're going to feel a really strong contraction. I'll do one now with you. Like normal breath in, normal breath out. Pinch the nose. Your hands are by your lower ribs. Try and breathe in, and you'll feel the one. You should feel something. It's like it's around that abdominal area, but it's like deep inside, and it feels a bit weird. It's like that's your diaphragm trying to pull down, but you're stopping air from moving.
And where are you breathing in this scenario? Where are you breathing from? Because I mean, in yoga terms, we have this idea of bandha, right? And bandha or bandha means a seal or lock in your lower abdomen. And you're using that to kind of pull the diaphragm down, but using not the abs, but using the muscles deeper than the abs to kind of pull the breath through the body.
Yeah, so that's what we're trying to think about the ribs moving outwardly, like laterally, and the diaphragm moving down and flattening out. So it's going to try to, ideally we want it moving downwards, but we want it to be flat. We want it to be moving out in all directions in 3 dimensions. Your midsection and your rib cage, it's a cylinder. It wants to be able to expand.
There's some kind of control
into the back everywhere.
There's some kind of control from the stomach as well, right? Are you doing anything with the stomach?
So it just in that particular particular drill is purely about getting you to feel a contraction of what does your diaphragm feel like to contract. So, if I asked you to tense your bicep, because you've got you've fired many neurons from your brain to that bicep, and you know what it feels like to do that, you can really contract that muscle and feel it quite strongly. A lot of people don't have that like body awareness as well as those neural like connections as well formed to the diaphragm to be able to actually contract it to the point of going like, okay, that's it. You can actually really feel it. So it's a way of like sending messages to the diaphragm to feel those contractions. It's one of the reasons why some of the breath holding work, when you do stronger ones, your diaphragm starts to contract because it gets messages from the brain automatically. And so it's a way of like training you to be able to contract that diaphragm better. Then the practicing of the mechanics of whether we do some work where we put our hands on our sides or hands on our back or even resistance bands around us or a breathing belt so that you're able to start to think about expanding that lower portion of the rib cage. So
you're saying you're breathing, you're targeting a kind of a medial breathing across the chest, right? Like, where do you put the breath? Where are you aiming the breath as it comes down the back of the trachea?
So, this again, as you're depending on if we're practicing just a breathing at rest, like I'm not needing to take a large amount of air in. I want to feel like a nice subtle movement of those ribs and of that diaphragm. But I might practice at rest some larger breaths where I'm looking at filling from the bottom and then starting to fill up gradually as we go through. So it's a lateral expansion of those lower ribs, but it starts to fill up vertically as well. So I practice being able to expand and mobilize those ribs, because the more I can expand and mobilize that rib cage, the more opportunity I've got for the lungs to expand and get more air in. I'm going to need that when I'm like doing exercises, yoga, running, whatever it is that I'm doing. So it depends what we're trying to achieve from the practice. Like, am I looking to work with someone to be able to ensure that they can actually, first of all, feel their diaphragm or not, or is it that their ribs aren't moving? What do we actually need to feel in order to this? Because it's, some people will struggle to expand into the back. Some people might be expanding more so on the right hand side because
that's interesting, right?
The diaphragm on the right hand side is bigger than the diaphragm on the left. We're not symmetrical internally. We're not symmetrical.
It's interesting.
Externally, we look symmetrical, so we think it's symmetrical. So it's there's, depending on how someone's currently breathing, depends on what part they might need to focus on. There's not necessarily like one cue that's going to
I understand,
be the right thing for everyone. But feeling the diaphragm contract by doing the blocked inhalation works for everyone, because you're just feeling it contract.
All right, well, we've done about an hour. I suppose I want to ask you finally, on that note, where are you, where are you focusing with the breathing now? Is it just simply, is it for training? Because, that's how you started it, right? To kind of get your training, to get the handbrake off. Or is it going somewhere else now, in terms of, you mentioned, obviously the yoga podcast, becoming more mindful and this kind of thing. Is that it? What are your aims for it?
So for my own self, it's like a continued sort of exploration of like what can I do with my breath. And at the moment, that looks like I ran my first marathon this year, nasal breathing. Oh, sorry, not now in 2022, last year. I'm doing an ultra 3-day event, running the coastal path in Anglesey. It's 135 miles in 3 days. That's in September. And my focus for all of my breathing is I've got 2 rules for my runs. It's all about the airflow in the nose and being as efficient with that as possible. So being as, not letting that get too hard or too strong or too fast, and finishing my run like I feel like I could do it all over again. So I run like 15K the other day, and it's like, how well did that run go? I'm not looking at the pace I did. I'm not looking at how long I did it. It's like, how did I feel when I was doing it? How did your breathing feel? Airflow felt good, so efficiency was good. Heart rate was then low. how do I feel? Could I go and do that again now? Yeah, I feel like I could do it again now because I haven't like flogged myself to get to that point. What I'm trying to do is, I like the idea of running for longer rather than just faster. And I like being outside. I like exploring nature. I love Anglesey. To run the coastal path there in 3 days is going to be hopefully a magical experience if it's not too miserable. Because if I'm able to manage my breathing, I know my heart rate and my nervous system will stay intact, and hopefully, therefore, it won't be then a miserable thing. In terms of like teaching and coaching, as I said at the beginning, like I want to try and help make breathwork normal, just like this thing that's just people are aware of their breathing, and it's it's not a difficult thing to do. It's not this extra thing we need to do. It's just making it part of our just breathing a little bit better as part of our day-to-day lives. I do some specific work in sports performance with like, particularly with my background previously in rugby. So working with some professional and international rugby players and teams. And then I also, the other side of away from sport, I work closely with a friend of mine that's a private GP that refers on clients that she's identified that have poor breathing and thinks that might be one of the tools that we can help them improve their stress, those that are struggling with sort of like chronic stress and anxiety issues. So working with those as well.
I suppose finally, I just want to pick your brains about anything that might implicate breathing in terms of diet and food. I mean, usually, in yoga, they'll say, dairy is mucus forming. You should, eschew, you should stay away from dairy and eggs, maybe. What are your thoughts on, is there any food more or less, better, worse? I'm
not an expert in this. I've just eaten an egg before we came on to this podcast.
You're suffocating.
If it is, and I also like milk, if it is detrimental, then maybe I would then be even better at breathing. But no, I'm not an expert on this area, and I'm not making a joke about it. To be honest, it will definitely impact it. Exactly what those things are, I don't personally
know. You're not sure yet.
Other than we do know for sure that but the same as anything, like poorly, highly processed food, high in sugar, those types of things, like they will. Because it's so detrimental to all aspects of our health, like they will impact your breathing. I've experienced that myself. Like if you eat a load of crap, like you see take your respiratory rate. That how many breaths you're taking a minute. Then have your crap processed food, and then take your respiratory rate again, and you'll see how much it dramatically changes. So yeah, it's an area. It's an area of interest, to be honest. To be fair, it's just not one that I've expanded any further into yet. I'm a bit worried. It's one of those things that I like milk, but I get like organic grass fed from a farm near us. It's like with one thing I do believe in is like go as close to source and as natural and as high a quality as you can afford.
Yeah.
Part of me will struggle that if I read a research paper that says I should, I'll be like, I don't want to drink oat milk.
Now you're vegan before you know it.
I know exactly.
All right. Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you.
Cool, man. I loved it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast. Really, really good. Thank you.
My pleasure.